video is about changing the crank seals or updating an older Pro engine to the new style crank bearing that has a built-in oil seal. Starting in 2004 and 2005, they changed the crank bearings so they have built-in seals, and there's two O-rings. This crank bearing has an O-ring on the exterior and the interior. That seals the bearing to the case and the crank. Then the seal itself goes into the bearing race, and the seal has a spring side which should point out. Here you can see there is the spring side visible from the exterior. Then you have in your cases two oil feed holes. The bottom one is the one that will align with a hole in the bearing race, and on newer cases there is a small mark on the side of the case to help you to align this new style bearing. On older cases, you just have to align it to the bottom hole. That is the hole in the bearing that feeds the oil into the bearing through that feed hole in the case. So on older cases, you need to mark the bearing and the case with a Sharpie so that you make sure when you're putting the bearing into the case that you have those two holes properly aligned. Again, it's the bottom of the two oil feed holes in the case lines perfectly with the center of the hole that's in the side of the bearing race. When you're putting this together, lubricate the parts, and it's best that the case half be heated like on a hot plate. This makes it a little bit larger, easier to put the bearing in there. Here you can see how that hole in the bearing aligns with the small mark on the case corresponding with that bottom oil feed hole. This is how it goes together. Then the left case half goes onto the crankshaft, and this is how you update an older engine for this new style bearing.
Beginning in mid-2013, the bearing has a laser-etched arrow showing the position of the oil feed hole, making it easier for you to install it into the cases. You must first preheat the engine cases to expand them. It's very important that you do not beat the bearings with a hammer. But a few hours before heating the cases, put those new bearings in your freezer and let them sit there and get really cold. They'll contract. I use a digital temperature gun to see how the process of heating of the cases is going. One side at a time, take those bearings out of the freezer and they will drop right in there. In this set of magnesium cases, you can clearly see that the bearing almost goes completely in just with its own gravity. Then taking a plastic hammer, very carefully I tap on the outer race only just to seat it. If you're updating an older Pro engine, you must remove these two bushings that are actually on the crank. These are what the original crank seals were riding on, and because they fit flush against the crank, it's almost impossible to remove them with a conventional puller unless you make a tool. Here I'm pointing out the bushing, and this is a bushing I'm holding in my hand so you can see what they look like. You will be discarding these. You will not be reusing these when you're updating an old engine. So I buy a big thick washer and a big shouldered nut. And these are for tractors or trucks. You can buy them at the auto parts store that deals in this type of thing. These are USA SAE. If you're in Europe, they'll be metric. But you need that nut to be able to slide over the crank and have some space on the sides. Then weld the washer to the nut, like that, and then it will slide over the crank, and then you can grip it with a puller tool. Now the reason I'm doing this way is by using this big nut, I shield the crank surface from sparks during the welding process, because you do not want to miss with that welder and put a weld spot on that polished crank itself. Taking a MIG welder or a TIG welder, then you just put, I use just 4 spot welds, the tool to the bushing. Then, depending on what type of a puller tool you have, you can then extract the bushing from the crank. Here I show you my spot welds attaching my homemade tool to the bushing. I'm using another type of a spacer bushing to get the proper alignment for my tool. My puller is a lockjaw type, so that when you put it on there, the jaws can't pop off. Then as I crank the puller, you can see little by little the bushing comes off of the crank. And as I said, with this type of a design of this special little tool I made, you cannot spark the crank with your welder during that process of attaching this homemade nut puller tool to that bushing you're removing. Here you can plainly see the bushing is still attached to my homemade tool, and then I just take away my pieces, and you can clearly see there the crank. That is how it will be when you update to the new bearings. Now, to cut the old bushing off, I use a die grinder, and I just cut through my 4 little spot welds. Obviously you need eye protection for this type of work. And then I put the tool on a belt sander and smooth it for using it on the other side. And this is what the crank looks like when it's ready to install in the new bearings. Thank you for watching my video. This is Jim Snell.